This is the first crate they received when they opened up the business here. They got it from Germany. Right here it says Germany. And they put it on the wall as decor. Love it. Doesn't that look cool? Saving the first crate. Why not?
It's time to hit the road and discover Texas with Annie Studebaker. Get ready to travel deep into the heart of the Lone Star State, meeting friendly folks and exploring fascinating places. Experience a way of life like nowhere else in the world as we uncover the rich history and culture of Texas. Discover adventure, discover excitement, discover Texas with Annie Studebaker.
San Antonio has a long and proud brewing history. Ranger Creek Brewing and Distilling carries out this fine tradition and brings with it something a little new. Welcome to the Ranger Creek's Brewstillery, where they brew beer, distill whiskey, and sometimes mix a little bit of both. Okay, we're all excited because today we're here with Mark McDavid, and we're here at Ranger Creek Brewing and Distilling Company. And tell us what we've got here and what we're about to see.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm one of the co-founders along with TJ. We're a small craft brewery and distillery in San Antonio. We make beer and we make whiskey. So we're going to give you guys a tour of the whole facility today.
Awesome. What do we see back here? What is all this?
Yeah, this is what we call our tasting room. This is about 1,000 square feet up front. This is where we operate our tasting room on the weekends. These barrels are actually full of beer that we use in our sour beer program. This beer will age for about a year, and it'll pick up a nice tart complexity in the course of that year as it ages. All of our whiskey barrels, which we'll take a look at out back, actually we want those to sit in the elements, not temperature controlled, and interact with the Texas environment to pick up some of the local flavor.
Oh wow, there's a lot to learn. Okay, let's get started.
Sounds great. We're a grain to glass manufacturer, which means everything that we make is going to start off as grain. This is our grain handling area. So wow. We buy these big sacks of grain. We mill it up in our mill room here. And the goal is to transform this grain into alcohol.
This milling room is awesome. Oh, wow.
We mill our grain. The goal is to mill it so that we can extract as much sugar as possible out of it. The grain's going to get turned into sugar. The sugar is going to get turned into alcohol. So that's kind of the whole process. And then when we make our whiskey, we're going to distill that alcohol into the concentrated high proof version. But it all starts right here. So bourbon is our flagship whiskey. We do 4 different whiskeys. We do a bourbon, a single malt, a rye whiskey. But bourbon's our flagship. Bourbon by law has to be made from corn. So we go through thousands of pounds of corn every single week. All of our corn is grown right here in Texas. So we only use Texas grown corn as a local ingredient. We're gonna mill it up to a really fine consistency to where it's basically like a corn flour, cornmeal consistency. After it gets all milled up throughout this whole process, which you can see is very dusty and creates a whole lot of dust in here. So we try to keep it enclosed until it gets over to the brew house. We're gonna mill it, and then we're gonna bring it over to the brew house to add hot water to it to start a process called mashing, which is where we're gonna extract the sugar from the grain.
Stainless steel.
Yeah, so we're a pretty unique operation because we do brewing and distilling. So we look like a brewery. We also look like a distillery because we're doing both in the same spot.
Ooh, it keeps going on over there.
Yeah, it's a pretty big warehouse back here.
Okay, so what are we looking at here?
So these are our fermentation tanks, which we're going to get to. The next part of the process is the brew house, which is these 5 tanks in the middle of the floor here. The milled grain is going to get transferred through this piping that runs across the ceiling, this chain and disc system. It's going to transfer the milled grain over to the brew house, and we're going to add hot water to it to start that mashing process. Luckily, we're actually doing a bourbon mash today.
But that's when it starts fermenting.
Not quite yet.
Not yet.
Mashing is where we're going to extract the sugar from the grain.
Just mash it.
Yep,
okay.
Exactly right. So all that grain is going to go into this vessel right over here. And watch your step.
Okay.
So this is our bourbon mash tun. You can hear it whirring around in there.
Okay.
So we actually have, you can see through all the tubing, we actually have a bourbon mash going on. We've added the grain into this big old mash tun. We've added hot water to it. We've been heating it up. Now we're cooling it back down, and we're circulating it through a heat exchanger to try to get the temperature to drop. And eventually this is going to be cool enough to where the mash is completed. All the basically long chain carbohydrates have been broken down into simple fermentable sugars. And we're going to cool that down to below 80 degrees so that we can pitch the yeast, which is going to start the fermentation process.
Right, it's got to have yeast, that's right.
So you can see we have this pump that's helping circulate all this mash. It's a thick, kind of gooey, porridgey consistency on the inside of
At a certain temperature, it's still going to be warm enough.
Exactly right.
Wow, to extract it.
We're going to add, we start with 70% corn, and then 16% rye, and then 14% barley. When we add the barley, it has all these enzymes that help break down that thick porridgey mash into a thinner mash, which help us be able to cool it down quicker and then transfer it more easily.
Oh yeah, you got to have just the right measurements and chemistry for this, right? Interesting. Don't go anywhere. When we return, we'll take a closer look at the distillation process.
Hold on to your hat. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. I was fascinated by how much Mark knew about distilling.
This is Josh, our assistant distiller.
Hi, Josh.
You can see he's covered in dust from milling all the grain. So yeah, this is our brew house, which is pretty unique because we're doing brewing and we're doing distilling in the same location on the same brew house. So we have a very unique customized system just for us. The beer and the whiskey are both gonna start on this brew house. Certain tanks are specifically for the beer side, and certain tanks are designated for the whiskey side. This mash tun is specifically for our bourbon mashes.
Mash tun.
Mash tun. Yep.
Okay. T-U-N.
Yep.
Tun.
And DSP means it's for our distilled spirits plant. That means it's only for the whiskey side of our business.
Oh, okay. And the beer one says what?
It will say, typically it'll just not have, it'll say brewery or DSP, or it'll say both, or it'll be unlabeled.
Okay.
Certain equipment we can use for either side of our business, and certain pieces have to be designated for one piece of our business or the other.
Wow.
So after that mash is done, basically the sugar has been extracted. We're going to transfer it over to our fermentation tank. You can see these hoses connected to our bourbon fermenter. This one's called Walker, which is named after one of the Texas Rangers. And there was a Walker Texas Ranger that was not Chuck Norris, actually. So
really? Interesting.
And the bourbon fermentation tanks are where we're going to actually create the alcohol. So all of that sugar that we extracted from the grain is going to go. We're going to pitch yeast on top of it. The yeast is going to eat that sugar and turn it into alcohol in a process called fermentation. So these tanks are all of our fermentation tanks. These two are designated specifically for bourbon. The conical tanks over here are designated specifically for beer. So these are what we use for our bourbon fermentation. Yeah, so during the process of fermentation, we're creating alcohol, but a byproduct of fermentation is carbon dioxide. So while that yeast is spinning around in there eating all that sugar, a bunch of CO2 gas is created during that process, and we have to release that gas. Otherwise it would grow inside these tanks and become very dangerous and create a lot of pressure.
Yes.
And we can't just open a valve or a manway to release that gas, because that would allow oxygen or bacteria to get inside, and that's what can kind of ruin your mash and make it taste weird. So we have to create an airlock, and we do that by a very simple way of just putting a hose in a bucket of sanitized liquid that allows the gas to escape as bubbles, but allows no oxygen or bacteria to get inside there. So when you see bubbling going on, you know that there's a good fermentation going on inside that tank. And if we could look inside that tank, the yeast would be spinning around in there, swirling around, being real active, eating all that sugar.
So more or less, how long does this stuff have to stay in the vats?
So
in these containers?
this primary fermentation for our whiskey is going to take us about 3 to 4 days.
Oh, okay.
Pretty quick process.
That
the yeast
is.
is going to be super active, and it's going to eat all that sugar really quickly.
And that's bourbon, that's corn.
Yes, correct. For our beer fermentations, those will take a little bit longer, maybe a week, sometimes 2 weeks if it's a really strong beer. But for our bourbon fermentation, it goes pretty quick.
Okay, but this release is for what, beer?
We use yeast for both. Basically for fermentation, if you're going to create alcohol, whether you're making beer, wine, or spirits, or whatever, you're going to use some type of yeast. And there's specific types of yeast that we're going to use for the beer side versus the whiskey side, but it's the same general concept.
Yes, definitely.
So you can see a little bit of what got transferred over here. That's kind of what the bourbon mash looks like, but it's a little more liquidy, and it's obvious there's 900 gallons of it in here, so or about to be going in here. So. Step 2 is distillation, where we're gonna concentrate those alcohols into a high-proof version. We've actually got that going on today as well, and that happens at our still over here. So this is stage 2 distillation. We're going to take a 9% foragey distiller's beer, and we're going to turn it into about a 70% high-proof alcohol.
Whoa. So this is all beer?
This is distiller's beer turning into whiskey.
Oh, into whiskey.
So one of the interesting things about what we do is that the first step of making whiskey is making beer. Distiller's beer is different than the beer that we drink, but our equipment doesn't really know or care about that difference.
Okay.
When you make beer, you take grain and you ferment it. When we make our distiller's beer, we take grain and we ferment it.
What's going on here?
So distillation is where we're going to concentrate the alcohols. We're going to do a double distillation, which is a very traditional way to distill your bourbon. The first run is called the stripping run. Stripping run is where we take the distiller's beer, all porridgey and thick, and it's going to go into the still. We're going to strip out the grain and the water, and it's just going to be left as clear, high-proof liquid called low wines.
Is that what that is?
This is the second distillation. So after we do the first distillation, we take all the low wines, we run them back through the still.
Low wines.
For the finishing run, which is the second distillation.
Okay.
Run. The finishing run, we put clear liquid in, and we get even stronger clear liquid out, super high proof alcohol. And we may actually make cuts in what comes off the still to decide what gets discarded and what goes in the barrel to become whiskey, and what we're going to save and redistill later. And making the cuts is a really important part of the distillation process, and it really matters the quality of the product you're going to get at the end of how you make those cuts and when you make those cuts. For this phase, which is our distillation phase, it's going to take us about 24 hours of distillation, which we're going to spread across probably 3 or 4 days in order to do. We're going to do 3 stripping runs at 6 hours each, so we do 18 hours of distillation. And then we do 1 finishing run at 8 hours, so we're going to do another 8 hours, 24 total hours of distillation.
Wow, so this started off as mush.
As grain, as corn.
Grain and water, right?
Yeah.
Amazing, and there it is.
And you turn it into this.
Alcohol.
The distillation process is interesting because it works due to a physical difference that alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. So water boils at 212 degrees, and alcohol starts to boil at 173 degrees. And it's that difference in boiling point that allows us to concentrate those alcohols. So at 173 degrees, we will see vapor travel up the column of that still. It'll come over to the condenser, which has cool water flowing through it. That vapor hits the cool piping and condenses back down into liquid form, which is what you see coming off the still here. So at 173 degrees, we have really strong alcohol, almost pure alcohol, not quite 200 proof, but super strong alcohol. And then as the temperature rises, we get different types of alcohol. and it gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. By the time you get to 212, it's pure water. There's no alcohol left. So distillation is taking place between 173 degrees and 212 degrees.
That's interesting to know.
This is where we start to taste the corn in our bourbon. This is where we start to taste the rye in our rye whiskey. And for whiskey, that's important. We want to taste the grain in the whiskey. So we're going to end up taking the hearts and a portion of the tails. We're going to make the cut, and that's what's going to go into the barrel to become our sipping whiskey.
And why does this have to be copper?
It doesn't have to be copper, but most of them are copper. Copper's a really good conductor of heat. So even though our heat source is only here at the bottom, it's still very hot at the top. Copper helps absorb sulfur, which is really important because we'll get a pure spirit. When we're done distilling, you'll see a black soot on the inside of the still every single time we distill, which is all that sulfur that it's absorbed, which results in a clean, nice clean whiskey. And then copper is just pretty too. So when we do tours, it's a nice piece to look at.
It's amazing. This
is definitely the most expensive piece of equipment that we have.
I can tell you, it looks nice.
This was handmade. All those divots in the copper are handmade by some artisan still makers, fourth generation still makers in Germany.
When we return, we'll step outside and learn about the aging process.
Hold on to your hat. We'll be right back.
So we've gone through fermentation, phase 1. We've gone through distillation, phase 2. The last phase is maturation, where we're going to take that clear spirit and we're going to put it in oak barrels.
And that's where it's going to mature.
That's where it's going to mature. This is the phase that takes the longest.
Nice.
So we do distillation 2 different ways, which is kind of an innovative way to think about it. Most distilleries, traditionally, the big Kentucky distilleries, use these big, large barrels. We use those big barrels, but those take years to mature. So we also use small barrels, which help us kind of experiment and innovate. We age those in 2 different locations, still all at the same facility, but the small barrels are aged right here in this big red shipping container.
Oh, wow, how nice. Oh, I can smell it.
Yeah, it smells delicious, right?
Wow. Not a bad smell. These are beautiful little containers. They're full of stuff.
Yeah, these are all full of whiskey.
Look
at that. We have a bunch of different experiments going on in here, and all of our commercial releases that we put in small barrels are aged in these 5 to 7 gallon barrels that are back here. So a small barrel is going to give you more surface area contact. And basically what happens during maturation is the spirit is totally clear coming off the still, just like we saw it coming off the still. It looks just like water, right?
Right.
It has no color to it, and it's a pretty raw, grainy corn whiskey at this point. It doesn't taste anything like bourbon yet.
Mostly alcohol, tastes like.
It's essentially corn whiskey, which is basically moonshine at that point.
Oof.
Now, we call it white dog, which is an industry term for bourbon before it goes into phase 3, when it comes off the still, before it gets aged in a barrel. So that white dog's going to pick up 100% of its color and about 80% of its flavor from the barrel during maturation.
From the wood barrel?
From the oak barrel, exactly right. It's going to completely transform into a different product during this phase.
It's like almost sweet.
It picks up sweetness, it picks up color, it picks up oak flavor. We're going to take the new charred oak, we're going to fill it with that white dog, and then Mother Nature's going to take over. So we want these barrels to be outside in the elements, because they're going to pick up local flavor, and it's going to taste like Texas whiskey when it ages here, as opposed to if it ages in Kentucky, where it's going to taste like it came from Kentucky. So that's super important. We don't temperature control this, we just let it exist in the elements here in San Antonio to pick up that nice flavor. So the white dog goes into the wood. In the heat of the day, that liquid expands and it travels through the char layer and into the wood. It starts to interact with these flavor compounds that the oak is comprised of, these vanillins and tannins and lignins, and it starts to break those down. And then at night when it cools off, it contracts and it's extracting those flavor compounds. So it's doing this on a daily basis, every single day, and it's doing this on a seasonal basis. When we go through our super hot summers, we cool down a little bit in the fall and the winter. All those seasonal changes are really important. So the expansion and contraction is extracting these vanillins and tannins and lignans, which are going to result in imparting all the color and most of the flavor into this whiskey. That's where we're going to get the sweetness, the caramel, and the vanilla, and the oak, and all these crazy complex flavors that come out of it.
Ranger Creek Brewing and Distilling is a fine part of Texas brewing legacy. The care and attention they put into their work shows in every bottle they produce. This tour was amazing, and it gave me a new appreciation for beer and whiskey. Well, Mark, it has been a pleasure. I am super impressed with this because it's so obvious that you take so much pride in your job and you want the best quality. And we thank you so much for this great opportunity to tour delicious stuff that you make. So
Absolutely. Thanks for being out
thank
here.
you so much. Cheers.
Cheers.
The friendly people in Ranger Creek taught me so much and really made me feel at home. The next time you're in the area, I think you should stop by and take a tour. You'll be glad you did. This is Annie Studebaker with Discover Texas. Until next time.